Welcome to Mating Matters, the podcast that looks at human behavior through a lens of evolutionary psychology and human mating strategy. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh.
I am Dr. Andrew Smiler. I'm a psychologist with a practice specializing in working with teen boys and adult men. And I am the author, most recently, of Is Masculinity Toxic? A primer for the 21st century.
You also wrote one of my favorite books, Challenging Casanova, that I still quote in my classes. So let us start from the beginning. You know, we're at a time where we are seeing a march toward more gender parity than we've seen for a long time in our human history. And in doing that, as we talk about women's rights and women's voices, and some people say we might even be moving toward a matriarchy, which I don't think it'll happen, more equality. This term toxic masculinity is being thrown around. Would you start by talking about the definition of just the term toxic? When we say something is toxic, what do we mean?
Sure. I am not a health expert or a medical expert, but my understanding of the word toxic is that it means something that is injurious to a person, does not need to be fatal, but does need to cause injury.
So how is it that being male, behaving male, speaking like a male has been construed by many people in these times to have some toxicity associated with it?
That is a fascinating question. I'm so glad you asked. Part of where this notion that masculinity is toxic comes from is really the culture itself. As we have moved towards more of an egalitarian framework for thinking about our culture and how things should be here in American culture in the early, 2000s, we've shifted from a system and a culture that always encouraged men to seek power or seek decision-making or seek authority, often at the expense of other people, to a culture that now values a system where everybody has equal opportunity, or at least where we'd like to think that everybody has equal opportunity. And within that equal opportunity framework, this system of male norms that are geared towards independent decision-making and achieving power and achieving status doesn't fit well. And so folks have labeled it as toxic as a way to point out some of those power imbalances and some of the ways that we have historically trained boys and men to seek power at the cost of others.
Could you give me some specific examples, ways that masculinity that used to be acceptable is now injurious to women?
So one of the realms where masculinity's tendency to injure women has become particularly apparent and gets shouted out and called out a lot here in 2019 is with the liberties, so to speak, or as we used to speak, that men have been encouraged to take with women. Most recently, we've had scandals around Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein, but we even have seen that in fictional accounts. If you look at characters such as Don Draper from Mad Men, a show that was set in the 1960s, or Charlie from 2.5 Men, we have this image of guys who feel like, women's bodies are more or less there for the taking, and that they can offer things, money, prestige, status to women, and in return, women should give men their bodies. And women should, in fact, expect that men might take or otherwise gain physical access to women's bodies before giving them anything. It's very much a trade-off system of some sort, where men get access to something that is personal to women, their bodies, whereas women get something that is less personal. And folks are casting that, and I think legitimately so, as injurious. It requires women to trade themselves for some external object like position or status or money.
So this podcast is about human mating strategy told through a lens of evolutionary psychology. And we've interviewed lots of experts about sort of the birth of patriarchy, if you will. And indeed, that in primate species, males have learned that when they hoard resources, women choose them more often to mate with. So what do you say about women's role in this, now unacceptable trade?
I think that's a great question. We certainly do see this pattern across species. Women certainly have a role to play. And one of the things that we know that feminism and the women's movement has done and has really encouraged women to do is to essentially think more carefully about whether or not they want to engage in that kind of trade. One of the reasons that the women's movement focused so much on access to education and access to better and better forms of employment, in part, was to break this cycle of women being financially dependent on men for a place to live, for their well-being. And we have certainly seen some changes as a result of that dynamic here in the U.S. I also want to point out something that gets overlooked when we talk about primates and even when we talk about human mating. The males who are not alphas also get opportunities to have sex or mate or reproduce, depending on what terminology we want to do that. It is not the case that all of the females only make themselves available to the alpha male. There are lots of other males, and almost all of them also get access to partners. It is not this kind of all or none system, but we often talk about it as though it's an all or none, that only the alpha males get access to female partners, and that is not actually the case.
And let's talk a little bit about male mating strategies when they are not considered the alpha male. If they're not showcasing resources like expensive vacations and jewelry and a lifestyle, how are they able to court women? What are their secret superpowers?
From the dating sites, I understand that honesty and a good sense of humor are big ones. Those appear in almost all of the personal ads. I don't think it's so much a function of different strategies. One of the things that we know from research on masculinity and some discussion of masculinities, the idea that there's more than one way to be masculine, so plural masculinity, is that different guys have different levels of resources. And so we talk about guys who are closest to fitting the cultural image, guys who are able to practice the hegemonic form as the guys with the highest status and the greatest amount of wealth, and thus access to the most partners. But then we also talk about other guys who are complicit in the jargon. And these are guys that are doing a lot of those same things, but aren't quite at the same level. So they support the system, but they're not necessarily as wealthy. Maybe in other terms, they're only upper middle class and not wealthy, or maybe they're only middle class, but kind of on their way up, or, something like that. But they still play the system. They're using the same strategies, but their ability to offer vacation isn't quite as good. Maybe not as many vacations. Maybe they're not quite as nice. We also see other guys in this masculinities framework who are subordinate. They support the system, they try to play along, but they really don't fit our image of what it means to be masculine. Nerds are the classic example here, right? We don't imagine them as smooth with women. We don't imagine them as good looking or particularly athletic, but they often make pretty good money, and they can offer some of these same benefits.
I was going to say, we wouldn't have nerds and starving artists if being smart and artistic were not good mating strategies.
That's right. And so maybe they pull, so to speak, for a different segment of the female population, but they're still effective mating strategies. So it's not just about who has the most or who kind of fits the image the best. There are lots of strategies here and lots of ways to find partners, and certainly lots of potential partners. It is not a one size fits all or one approach fits all.
One of the challenges for women who spend a big chunk of their fertility window getting higher education and building their careers is they land in their early 30s with a scramble for mates. A lot of the alphas are busy riding this wave of free sex that's happening in our high supply sexual economy. And yet, these women don't like to date down. There's been some research to show there's a sociologist in, I think, Scotland who came up with the term the George Clooney effect. The more money a woman makes, the more education she has, the more she wants a man to be more educated, older, and have more financial affluence. What do you say to women who unknowingly are suffering from the George Clooney effect?
I kind of want to quibble with your choice of the word suffering there. Again, I think this is a strategy, a relatively newer strategy in terms of kind of cultural history here, that women have adopted, that women are now able to adopt, given the changes in access to higher education and to high salary careers. And there aren't as many men available as they would like, and men don't seem to be catching up, perhaps, at least demographically. We know that women outnumber men in the US at all levels of higher education, and they have for about 30 years at the undergraduate level. It's a little more recent than that for the graduate level. Men are not employing this kind of a strategy that would make them attractive to these women, at least not at the same rate that the women kind of want or need them to be there. But it is in some ways a historical or generational shift, and it may yet balance out, and it may not. One of the great myths of American culture, and more so over the last 50 years, and more so even as we've moved into the digital age, is that you can find your soulmate and you can find the perfect partner, and that there are literally millions of potential partners out there. And if you try hard enough, you'll find the perfect partner and you won't have to settle. And that is a relatively new myth in our culture, at least for the mass audience.
Yes, that word settle always bothers me because I love Donald Winnicott's theory of the good enough parent. And I say you need a good enough boyfriend. That's all you need.
Right. Your whole life is not going to become about your spouse. You should still have friends outside your marriage, and you should spend time with them and talk to them. And your long-term partner, whether we call that a spouse or something else, probably should not be your best friend. But that is not, and that is the reality. And we see that from data. It is one of the reasons that we think that men who outlive their wives die much sooner than women who outlive their husbands, because she tends to be his best friend and his primary emotional support, whereas she tends to have other folks. But this is a myth that has really gained traction in the US over the last 20 or 40 years or so, that your partner will do it all for you. And at no other time in our history, and at no other time in the history of the English-speaking world, as far as I can tell, has that been the primary conception of what your long-term partner should be.
Exactly. If you could give advice to a man who wants to be current in the post-Me Too movement, who wants to not have toxic masculinity, if you gave him some kind of advice on relating to women, what would that advice be?
The best advice that I can give, and in some ways this comes out of my clinical practice and some of the men that I work with, is to have a good understanding of yourself and what you need in order to be happy and what you want in a partner. And doing that, having that real understanding of yourself, includes being able to set boundaries to identify what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do and what's negotiable, and being able to reasonably stick to those boundaries, but also to be flexible when it's appropriate to be flexible. Not always being the one to give in, but not always being the one to get your way either.
There's a secret out there that a lot of women don't know, and I know you know this secret.
What is it?
Men have feelings too.
Oh my gosh, don't say that. Yeah, absolutely, and they always have. And again, when we look at earlier periods in American history, when we look at other cultures, we see times and places where men have been encouraged and allowed to express a broader range of feelings than they are today. In US culture right now, men are allowed to show anger, sort of, within certain bounds. They are less able to demonstrate lust than they were, say, when in the 60s, we go back to that Don Draper image. But if we go back, 150 years to the Romantic era, or if we look at how male characters in Shakespeare plays are presented and how they talk to each other, we see a much more emotional model of manhood.
That included expressing feelings of sadness, vulnerability, love. What else?
Right. Affection for other men. One of the things that I see a lot when I watch, particularly the Shakespearean comedies, whether that's on screen or on stage, men taking each other arm in arm or putting their arm around each other's shoulders and just walking together like that. And men telling each other that they love them and that they care for them and that they are best friends and that they wouldn't be able to survive without this other guy in their life. And these are things that mostly we think require alcohol today. And you have to be drunk if you're a guy and you're going to tell another guy, straight guys, that you love him. We can't, it's hard to imagine two men walking arm in arm down the street as an indicator of friendship or closeness that isn't about a sexual relationship. But that used to be commonplace.
If I gave you a crystal ball and asked you to look at our mating life in the future, once this paradigm shift has finished taking place in the gender wars, what would love and marriage and relationships look like?
Wow. I wish you would give me that crystal ball so I could make $1 zillion. I think we're going to see a real bifurcation or perhaps trifurcation. And if I talk long enough, we might even get to 4. So that would be a quadfurcation. I think we're going to have a segment of the population that is what we might call traditional or kind of Christian conservative, where dating and sex are really about marriage and finding a long-term partner. And we know that that exists already, that there are young men and young women out there who date explicitly to find a long-term partner. And so they don't start dating until later than average. And they don't date simply to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Like by the 3rd or 4th date, if you don't feel like this person is right for you and could be your long-term partner, like then the relationship ends. You don't just date to date. I think we're going to have a segment of the population that continues to engage in and kind of push the boundaries of what we now call hookup culture, where it's all about going out and having fun and having sex with whoever you want, whenever you want, with relatively little interest in a long-term relationship until, say, later 20s or early 30s. And then I think we're going to have a bunch of folks kind of in the middle that aren't sure if they're looking for that long-term relationship kind of from an earlier age, or if they're trying to just have some fun and hook up for a little while, and then they're going to gradually shift into seeking a long-term relationship. But I think those kind of the market, if you will, is going to get segmented in that way.
I think it already is in many ways.
Yeah, I think
certainly,
so.
if you look at the profiles on the dating apps, people are very open about what they want, whether they're practicing conscious non-monogamy or they're looking for hookups or they're looking for a long-term relationship. They just put it out there and they say it right away in their profile.
Absolutely. And again, talking to some of the young men who come into my practice, the guys in their 20s and even into their early 30s, There is still some overlap in the apps. Like everybody seems pretty clear that there are certain websites that are really kind of dating websites, and those places like Match and eHarmony advertise explicitly about we've created this many marriages. But then there's other dating websites or apps like Tinder or Grindr, where it still seems like there's a lot of back and forth. I mean, nominally, those have been about hookups, but a lot of the guys that I talk to who are in their 20s talk about meeting someone that they date for months and years and potentially even get married to from those apps as well, the hookup apps. So I think it's still a little bit blurry out there.
Yeah, I think that, and for the middle group would be Bumble, which is run by
yes, yeah,
right. Okay, so I would like for you to describe for me. You speak to so many men in your practice, and they disclose things to you that many of them would never even tell the women in their lives. What makes a man fall in love, and what is the process of falling in love? I suspect they don't fall in love necessarily through a hookup.
No, they don't tend to fall in love through a hookup. One of the things that seems to happen, and this comes from both my clinical experience, but also from some of the literature on relationship formation, is that a lot of men seem to fall for someone more quickly than women do. And I think part of that comes out of men's desire for emotional intimacy. For men who really need some type of emotional connection before they can be sexual with someone, guys for whom hookups don't exactly work easily. If for those guys, if they can be sexual with someone, if they can feel comfortable with that partner, that seems to facilitate the emotional intimacy and the emotional connection as well. And we know that men, teenage boys, young adult men, men throughout adulthood, tend to have less emotionally intimate relationships than their female peers. So a lot of men get this combination of both sexual intimacy and emotional intimacy all at once, and she, in most cases, becomes the only person that he feels comfortable with and the only person that he can open up to. And so guys appear to fall in love faster because their new partner is meeting needs that emotional needs that aren't getting met anywhere else in life. Whereas she is much more likely to have friends that she is emotionally intimate with, and thus doesn't get quite the same kind of kick out of that early stage of relationship, the infatuation stage. So that's a big piece.
I like to say that men put all their emotional eggs in one basket.
Yes, and in many cases that is true.
But having said that, women suffer from something else sometimes, which is if they do have an early onset sexual relationship while they're assessing a partner, women's bodies emit a ton of oxytocin, as do men's, but it's often trumped by or blunted by testosterone. And so if women are consistently having sex with somebody, even if it's a hookup, they may start to have feelings of love because the bonding hormones are charging through their bodies. And men can more easily have sex and move on. I guess the biggest problem in my question, assuming that there's only one kind of man.
Absolutely. And what the research shows, and I document some of this in Challenging Casanova that you referenced earlier, is that there really are kind of different populations of men. There are the guys who are able to have sexual hookup or kind of a one-night stand, if you want to use the older terminology, without any real difficulty. Physically, they have no problems getting hard with a new partner. Emotionally, they're able to connect or disconnect kind of at will as needed for that scenario. But they're a minority population of men. The majority of men need something of an emotional connection in order to be sexually comfortable, and in many cases in order to get it up and actually have penetrative intercourse. And that's the majority of guys. So that dynamic with the oxytocin and kind of falling in love as you get to know someone and across those first several hookups that's certainly going on for a lot of guys as well, but that's not our image of male sexuality. We think that most guys or all guys just want the hookup.
We're dumbfounded, two women here going, oh, these aren't the men we've met. Interesting. So you are like busting some myths here. Is there anything else you can tell us about sort of the changing nature of maleness? And specifically, if you can talk about anything to do with evolution, how we've changed or not. Some people say, I talked to Dr. Helen Fisher last week, and she says we're returning to something far more natural when in an egalitarian society, where, interesting enough, back in our hunter-gatherer times, we didn't have these giant males that were NFL football players and 7-foot-tall basketball players. They evolved because women kept choosing, and they adapted as a result. But a few 100,000 years ago, even our body sizes were similar. Are you aware of any research on that?
I have seen some of that research. That's not a research realm that I focus on. But one of the things I will remind folks or encourage folks to think about, when we talk about what was expected of men in hunter-gatherer times, or even in early kind of agricultural tribes who were not particularly nomadic, until they hit physical maturity, so until they reached puberty, young boys often helped out the women. They were gathering, they were not hunting. They were maybe allowed to set traps once they hit 6 or 8 or 10 years and kind of earned that privilege, but it was something they had to earn. And they were not allowed to just sit around and do the prehistoric version of, sitting around and playing video games. Like, they worked and they were out with the women gathering, cleaning the kill, kind of whatever. And we see the same thing for men who are infirmed or men who are older and no longer able to go out and hunt. They also helped out in the campsite. It's just this kind of small period of time between puberty and old age or injury, which of course overlaps with the reproductive years, where men were doing the hunting and doing the kind of hardcore athletic stuff. It's not that men got, young boys and men had the opportunity to develop a lot of the same skills that the women did. But we kind of forget that was also part of what it meant to be a man in those tribes, in those clans.
And I will say, I saw a photograph recently, I think it was in a book by Dr. David Buss, of a 7-year-old girl proudly holding up this dead bird that she'd caught. And that girls also hunted small game. And as adults, women served as trackers and trappers, and male hunters brought back a whole lot more when they had a woman with them.
Yep.
Because of that. So my father was raised on a farm with very strict gender roles. And he had supposedly, it was reported to us, terrible, terrible hay fever and allergies. And he could not do the hay. Well, you can't do nothing if you have hay fever on a farm. So his grandmother kept him in the house so that he would be healthy, and taught him how to cook and sew and quilt. And he enjoyed it so much. And he went on to become a high-ranking officer in the Navy. But he always made and designed my mother's New Year's Eve gown, always made little dresses for me and sewed them, because he was the best sewer in the house. And nobody was allowed to know about this, by the way. It was always a secret. Yeah.
Right.
But he had these skills.
And when we think about gender roles, again, some of the historical comparisons, some of the cross-cultural comparisons are particularly important. One of my favorite quotes, and I'm going to paraphrase here, comes from Alexis de Tocqueville, who visited the U.S. in the 1800s and came back to Europe and wrote about it. And he was explicit that the separation of the sexes and the hard line drawn in gender roles here in the U.S. was very different than what they were doing in Europe. And that we had taken it to a whole level beyond what he saw in France and England and Germany and Italy.
And I'm sure you're familiar with the Man Box study with the UK, Mexico, and America.
Yeah, recently, yes.
And that clearly the men in the USA are much more deeply entrenched in the man box than even men in the UK, and very little in the man box in Mexico, where you'd think this myth of this Latino machismo, they actually love family and mothers and are able to express a greater range of feelings.
Right. And part of the cultural roles and part of the gender roles for men and throughout Spanish-speaking Western Hemisphere, throughout Latin America, explicitly includes respect for family and taking care of family and respect for elders, regardless of their sex. So there's something of a counterbalance, at least we would phrase that as a counterbalance here in the US. But for them, it is all part and parcel of the larger fabric of masculinity.
For people raising boys, mothers and fathers today, what advice do you give to them?
Wow, that's a great question. I think I'm going to go with 2 or 3 or 10 if you let me talk long enough.
Sure.
One is, and I'm going to echo the big secret that you mentioned earlier, is that boys have feelings. And we need to talk to boys about what they are feeling. We need to talk to boys to help them understand what other people are feeling and how feelings drive behaviors. And that starts early in childhood. When we look at studies of elementary age kids 6 to 10, we often find that parents talk to boys about their feelings less than they talk to girls about the girls' feelings. And if we think about kind of building an emotional vocabulary or building familiarity with your own feelings, that's a choice that we as adults make, and we make it when our kids are young. And then, somehow we're surprised when our teenage boys don't want to talk to us about feelings, even though we haven't really talked to them about their feelings for the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. So that's one. The other thing that I often encourage parents to do is to start talking about relationships and what makes a good relationship, whether that's a friendship or a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship, and do that early as well. As early as 10, you can do it before then, so that boys in particular start to understand how their actions and their words and their feelings impact the people that are important to them, and how they're impacted in the same ways by the people that are important to them. And I often encourage parents to do this, to use examples from the media. If you have a show that you watch with your kids, whether that's something older like Friends or 2.5 Men, or something more current like Modern Family or Blackish, talk about the relationships you see on screen. What's good about them, what's bad about them, there's 4 different relationships, romantic relationships in the show. Which one would you most like to be in? Or who would you most like to date? And why that person? Why not the other person? To help boys start to get a framework for what a good friendship is or what a good romantic relationship is before they get to the point where that's consuming a lot of their time.
Because traditionally, the only talk about relationships that most teenage boys get is the plumbing lesson and the birth control warning.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we know that sports is a big thing for a lot of boys. We often hear talk about, so-and-so is a good teammate. And I will tell you, I follow 3 professional sports. So I hear a lot of talk about, so-and-so is a good teammate. But the announcers never tell me what it means to be a good teammate. Is he a good teammate because he helps other players, understand their position better, or kind of tweak their approach or their physicality? Is he the kind of, the guy who cheers everybody up or gets everybody on the same page, is kind of a leader? They don't talk about that. They just say he's a good teammate, and then they move on, but there's no details. So as a viewer, as someone who might be modeling my friendships based on what it means to be a good teammate, I don't get any details, but we need the details.
Tell me, how are guys feeling post Me Too?
So that's a great question. I get a lot of different reactions from the guys I talk to, both in clinical practice and when I do speaking engagements. For simplicity, I'm going to talk about two different types of reactions. The guys who really seem to have bought into kind of the dominant cultural expectations around what it means to be a man or how to be masculine, they're kind of indignant. They feel like the rules are being changed in the middle of the game, if you will, and that should not be allowed, and that nobody is really helping them understand what to do, how they might do it differently, because they only have one model and they're being told they can't use that model, but they're not being told what to do. So they're kind of left high and dry, and they're pretty pissed off about it. The kind of simplified other segment of the world are the guys who I tend to think of as nice guys. We might call them betas or chads if you're into those kind of terminologies. And they're really taking it to heart because they try to be nice and they try to be respectful. And so they then worry about, oh my God, am I not respectful enough? Or am I not kind of good enough in this Me Too era? And some of them actively come and ask me questions, for lack of a better word, to help them refine their technique or to be more respectful. Some of them are saying that they're opting out, that they would just rather be alone and watch porn instead of risking being labeled some kind of sexual offender.
Wow, that's heartbreaking.
What is your advice to them?
Really is.
Yeah, what's your advice to them?
My advice, and I do a little education, some of which is along the lines of what we've talked about here, about kind of the nice guys and the guys who are kind of doing something more extreme, is to stay with it and to take some risks, and they may kind of moderate their risks. And we sometimes talk about kind of how to phrase questions like, "Can I take you out?" Or we have some long talks about how do you ask for consent to kiss someone, to hold somebody's hands, to have sex, particularly for the first time, but also then how to check in at later points to see if things are okay or not okay.
Have you been on men's retreats? Is this what is the experience for men at a men's retreat? Or do they just sort of bash women the whole time, or how does that work?
Look, we get on retreats and bash men all the time, so it's their
Right.
turn.
I'm just curious.
Right, there's some parity there. It quite honestly, it depends a lot on who's running the retreat and really, kind of what their framework is for leading it. If you look at an organization like the Mankind Project, which has chapters in every state here in the U.S. And a number of countries outside the U.S., they are very conscious about masculinity and some of the history of masculinity and current norms. And while there will certainly be almost inevitably some round of my partner, male or female, has treated me wrong, there's a lot of work helping the men express themselves in genuine ways to the other guys, and the other guys have more caring responses back, and encouragement to do that with the women in their lives as well. So they have this experience when they're in men's groups, and then they're encouraged to use that in the rest of their lives as well. And the Mankind Project has recently taken to a model that helps the guys have contact between these kind of weekend retreats and not just wait 3 or 6 months until you can get to your next retreat.
I'm quite envious because I don't recall in the 70s or 80s that we had women's groups that helped us get into the workplace and make money and act the way we were supposed to as things were changing then. We had Gloria Steinem maybe, but we really never had.
And my impression is that some of the consciousness raising groups did that, but they weren't always kind of ongoing events. But on the other side, there's like the boot camps on how to be a pickup artist, and those folks really seem to trash women and talk about, it's all about getting laid and, getting your score up.
You know the guy who wrote that book, right? The Game?
Mark Mason?
No.
Yeah.
The Game is written by Neil Strauss. Okay, so he wrote this book that became this mega, mega, mega bestseller, right? Called The Game, which was basically telling, because he was the nerdy guy who hung out with rock stars, and he found ways to pick up women. And he, like, some of his tricks would just curl your hair. It was stuff like the hottest girl in a group You have to ignore her and treat her like shit and give a ton of attention to her ugly friend, because then you'll set up female to female competition and she'll be into you. And he used this as a strategy, and he got laid so much. Well, anyway, eventually he ends up in therapy, of course, ends up getting into his early childhood stuff, ends up falling in love with a woman who won't give him the time of day, and writes a book that when I received the press copy, it was leather-bound white, trimmed in gold, that looked exactly like a Bible with a gold ribbon in it. And it was called The Truth. It was embossed, The Truth, like as if it was a Bible. And it's a memoir of his whole journey from playboy to committed husband and father. And you should read it, because it's about him seeing the light and feeling absolute shame over what he taught men to do. And it's about his journey toward real emotional intimacy.
Right.
It is a beautiful book.
It sounds amazing. And I've certainly, again, when I'm speaking in public, some of the guys who come to my office tell similar stories about, they were just an asshole and they were out to get laid, and that's what they did for 5, 10, 20 years. And then at some point they realize they want or need something more, that they want this kind of emotional connection with a partner.
Yeah.
And that all of these strategies that they use to get laid just get them sex and don't get them this kind of emotional connection, and that they need to do relationships, do sexuality differently.
Yeah.
And it does make for some really amazing transitions.
Oh, yeah. Well, so great to speak with you again. Keep in touch. Let me know if you're ever in town again.
Yeah, and it's been great being here. If I can help you out again in future, please do let me know.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Mating Matters. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh. We'll see you next time.